Just how far would you go to be with the one you loved? Would you give them your last chocolate? Would you walk 1,000 miles to fall down at their door? Or would you spend your life with just one person? And what about the afterlife? Would you dedicate that to them as well? This is the true story of Carl Tanzler and Eleanor de Hoyos. What Carl did to be with his love will leave you in absolute shock. Was he a hopeless romantic? Or was he an obsessive maniac? Firstly though, if this story is of interest to you, please click that like button. And if you don't want to miss any future uploads, click subscribe with all notifications turned on. Thank you, and let's get started with the story. I hope you enjoy it.
Ahoy, me mateys. Welcome to Pirate Soup.
In Dresden, in Germany, in 1889, there was a young boy aged just 12 years old. His name was Carl Tanzler, and he had a dream so profusely vivid that when he woke up, he thought it had actually happened to him. He eventually composed himself and remembered that it was only a dream. But in the dream, Carl claimed that Countess Anna Constantia von Coser, a purported long-since-dead ancestor of Carl's, she gave him the image of a woman with black hair and told him that this woman will at some point come to him in his life, and it's God's will that he's to save her life. Years later, in 1926, Carl married a local woman from Dresden, and the two had daughters together. Carl was still having the dreams of a long-dead relative, and this image of this beautiful black-haired woman still burned in his mind. His wife wasn't this woman. Economic downturn in Germany during the 1920s ultimately led Carl Tanzler, his wife, and their two daughters to emigrate to the US in search of a better life. They moved to Central Florida, where after a few months, Carl would abandon his family and move to Key West in the South of Florida. Carl decided to call himself Count Carl von Coser in homage to the dead relative from his dreams, and he managed to get himself a job in the hospital in Key West as a radiology technologist. And one day, when doing his usual tasks, an older woman came to the lab for a scan on her daughter. Her daughter hadn't stopped coughing for a long time. And when this 21-year-old daughter walked in, Carl dropped everything. He knew immediately that this pretty young Cuban-American woman was in fact the woman from his dreams. This is who the dead ancestor was talking about. Carl knew he had to do God's work. Carl immediately promised the mother and the daughter that he would do everything within his power to save this young woman's life. The mother and daughter were both terrified she only came in with a cough, but they were thankful to this Dr. Tanzler. As examinations proved, however, Eleanor, as the young woman was called, had developed tuberculosis, and back then that was a death sentence. Nowadays, it's a curable disease, but back then, very few people survived it. Eleanor repeatedly went back for more tests, and Tanzler had abandoned standard hospital practices due to the lack of treatments for TB. He'd bought potions and elixirs, and he'd taken them to Eleanor's home. After all these experimental procedures, nothing seemed to work, and on the 25th of October in 1931, Eleanor de Hoyos sadly passed away. Carl was completely broken by this news. As he'd become so close to Eleanor over the year, he went as far as confessing his undying love for her, and it had always been unrequited. Carl offered to pay for the funeral and an extravagant mausoleum for Eleanor. Eleanor's family were not rich by any means, and they knew how fond the kind doctor, who wasn't actually a doctor, was of their daughter. and they gladly accepted his offer. Following the death of Eleanor and the subsequent funeral, Carl visited the mausoleum every single night to talk to Eleanor. He was so apologetic for not saving her life, it had taken over his own life. Night after night, he would visit the mausoleum. Eleanor's family knew about it and thought it was quite odd, but he was a pretty peculiar character anyway, and they knew how close he'd become to Eleanor. Nights turned into weeks, turned into months, and it was 2 years later that Eleanor's family had grown tired of Tanzler constantly going to their dead daughter's grave. He was beginning to make this about himself. But they were her family, not him. When the family had had enough, they asked Carl to stop going to the mausoleum, which he did after 2 years. Time passed and Carl stopped going to the mausoleum. Over the next few years, however, rumours around the small town of Key West started to circulate. Carl Tanzler was this lonely recluse and lived alone, but he'd been buying women's clothes and jewellery and perfume. And once, a boy had seen Tanzler in the window of his home, dancing with what looked like a life-sized doll. Confused by the rumours around town, and worried about this nice Dr. Tanzler, Eleanor's sister, Florinda, went to Tanzler's house to ask for the key back to the mausoleum. It had been 7 years since Tanzler last visited, and the mausoleum was starting to be in need of some light work around it. Florinda also wanted to know what all the rumours around town were about. When Florinda arrived at Tanzler's home, he just let her in. Through one crack in a slightly open door, Florinda noticed something, and she screams. She runs out of the house as fast as she can and heads straight for the police station. Key West police listened to what Florinda was telling them, and they immediately go to Tanzler's house to investigate what Florinda had told them. The doll that the boy had seen and mentioned with the rumours circling around town. The doll that Florinda had seen was not only a lifelike effigy of Florinda's sister Eleanor, it was indeed her mummified body. The night that Carl Tanzler had stopped going to the mausoleum, he had taken a child's toy wagon and put the corpse of Eleanor on the wagon and wheeled it all the way to his home to keep her there. Nights were no longer needed at the mausoleum. It had been 9 long years since Eleanor's death, and for the past 7 years, Carl had been keeping the corpse of Eleanor at his home. He'd fashioned an old aeroplane into his makeshift laboratory and used piano wire to keep her body, for the most part, intact. He stuffed the body with rags to give it more life, so to speak. He'd given it glass eyes, sprayed it with perfume to hide the stench of death. He'd bought clothes and jewellery for Eleanor. Carl eventually left Key West for Pasco County. He led a quiet life and obtained his US citizenship in 1950. He died at the age of 75 on the 3rd of July 1952. There were some rumours that his body was discovered in the arms of a new effigy that he'd created from a death mask, but the official word is that his body was found behind an organ at his home. It was rumoured as well that Tanzler had swapped the body of Eleanor with the effigy he'd created, but there's no evidence of that. An article was later published in the 1980s claiming that a letter written by Tanzler himself had been discovered during renovation work. The letter is said to read as a confession that Tanzler had in fact poisoned his beloved to put her out of her misery and end her suffering. We may well never know all the details of Carl Tanzler's one-sided love affair with Eleanor, but it's likely that most, probably would want to keep it that way.